All right, good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Justin Major from Rowan University, coming to us from the engineering, experiential engineering education department at Rowan University. So I'm really excited to have Justin here. I know Justin from back when he was a grad student. I will admit that I did try to recruit him to Michigan to work in my lab. Fortunately, did not work out. But I now have the pleasure of working with him on a collaborative project. So it did all work out in that way. And so Justin is somebody I've admired their work for a long time. And now that I've gotten to work with them on this project, I've also get to see how Justin supports students and get to know their work much better. So I'm really excited to have them here today for our seminar series, and I'm looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
It says that it said that Sydney Finelli was talking, which makes me think that there's something going on in the Zoom. So Zoom all good? Okay, sorry.
Okay. So good. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. This is so exciting. I was telling Betsy this morning, I have never gotten to do an in-person seminar, so this is like my first one to do, which is really exciting to do that. Zoom is not as fun and close-knit, so thanks again for having me. So I'll be talking about household functioning today and its impact upon low-income student sense of belonging. This is a series of projects. A lot of it I haven't gotten to publish, and I was telling Betsy this morning that I was making a list last night of all the things I need to publish. So a lot of this will be coming soon in paper form. You know, lots of cool things to look at and see. Yeah, I think that was all I was going to say. So I do want to start out with some acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge the land that we're on, both for our Indigenous caretakers, as well as the labor that it takes to make engineering education happen. We often don't talk about the role that engineering education plays in inequality. We have underpaid graduate students and low-income students doing work all around, low-income folks who are our janitorial staff in our buildings, folks who work in gift card offices, or all these different places. Typically are not making what they should in a living wage. So I always want to recognize that. Next, I want to acknowledge that the work that we're going to be talking about today does touch on trauma. So as a content warning, many of us are experiencing different things in our lives that may be elicited by today's discussion. If you need any of those moments, please know that we're all thinking of you, and if you need to leave, I totally understand. And there are resources. Last, I want to recognize my students who played an integral part of this. So my lab is Advancing Student Pathways in Inequality Research and Engineering Education, which is Aspire. I have wonderful students doing wonderful work. So Nargis is doing work on Middle Eastern women in engineering. Martha just graduated and she was working on experiences of Colombian women in engineering. Fatima is looking at mental health and AI. And Ash is looking at LGBTQ experiences in engineering and identity negotiation. So wonderful work from our group. I also want to acknowledge the work is funded by the National Science Foundation, and some of it I'll be talking about today. And then some of it is also funded by the New Jersey Secretary of Higher Education. So thanks to them as well for funding some of this work. So a little bit about me. This is my 14th year in engineering education. As Karen said, I've been around for a long time. Originally, I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada. And I went to University of Nevada, Reno, up in Reno to do my bachelor's in mechanical engineering and secondary education in math. And then I went to Purdue and I did my master's in engineering education, master's in aerospace, and my PhD in engineering education. I'm currently at Rowan University as an assistant professor of experiential engineering education. And as of last week, I'm also the faculty fellow for student access and pathways, which means our transition programs, so like TRIO, Gear Up, programs like that bring students in to transition into the university in like 2+2 programs, things like that. I'm now assessing those programs and helping our low-income students come to Rowan. So as I mentioned, I come from Las Vegas. This is the Las Vegas we know, very shiny. But that's not the Las Vegas I knew. I knew this Las Vegas, the Las Vegas that was 50th in the nation. The state was 50th in the nation for education. Houses look like this. I lived on the edge of the desert, beautiful mountains, but I didn't really see a lot of that. I could look out into the distance and see downtown Las Vegas from far away. I went to Red Rock Elementary School, which was a Title I school. I didn't know what that meant as a kid. I didn't know that receiving free lunch and free breakfast and all those things was not a normal thing. But the other Vegas that I knew was this one, the one where homelessness is rampant. Not many people know, but there are tunnels under the city of Las Vegas where full cities are thriving. They think thousands of people, probably 10 to 15,000 people live under there. And every time it rains, they have to move or they get washed out. There are tent cities in Las Vegas. And if you know anything about Vegas, the average temperature in the summertime is 120 to 130 degrees. And so there is a lot about poverty happening in Las Vegas that I became aware of. I didn't know I was a low-income student until later on, but I knew about these issues. I was taught about them from a young age. And when I was 16, I started telling these stories in a project called Where There Are No Lights. It was a documentary project. I used to make hundreds and thousands of bologna sandwiches, and I used to go out and actually collect these stories with a video camera. I didn't know at the time that I was, I guess, contributing to, a problem of trading food for stories. But I got to collect a lot of these and tell these stories. And some of them I've kind of pulled down since then, now that I know the ethics of research and things like that. But this really led me to do the work that I was doing. It was here that I really started realizing that I was low income and that I wanted to do something about it throughout my life. So I found engineering on accident. I was supposed to be in a home ec class and they moved me to a CAD class. And so I found this thing called engineering. I wanted to do psychology at first, which is kind of funny that I'm now in engineering education doing social and behavioral research. I was on a robotics team, and a lot of the other folks around me were low-income students. We were not a great team. I know FIRST is very, very big in this area. There's me in the back, and funny enough, there's my wife. So we met there and have done engineering ever since, and we've been married 9 years now. So I went off to the University of Nevada, Reno, and I became a STEM education leader in the area. I worked with lots of low-income students. I worked with incarcerated youth, teaching them robotics. I taught robotics as early as 3 years old and up to college. I got to work for FIRST Robotics nationally for a couple of years, going around the state and starting programs, mentoring and supporting parents as well as students. And I'm telling you this because my positionality is really important in all this. Throughout this time of my life, I was kind of learning what it meant to be a low-income student. And I started realizing that it wasn't all the stories you hear. It's not just, abrupt poverty. It's also these other higher up experiences. And it's not just about money, it's also about the experiences that go with money. So my family was living below the poverty line, and I had no idea until I was older. And I didn't realize that the domestic and sexual violence that was happening in my life was not normal, or I should say, not as normal as I thought. When I was in high school, or right before high school, I lived in a tent. And so I got to experience that in San Antonio, Texas. And as a result, I started figuring out that I had post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I share that because I think it's an important part of my story and who I am. And also the conditions that I was under. I have an immune disorder that has really impacted my life. I get sick very easily, which is why I had to cancel the seminar earlier in the year. But these are really important parts of my life. And as an engineering student, this left me feeling very isolated and alone, especially when I started coming to and realizing that these things really were impacting my life and they weren't as normal for everybody else around me in engineering. A lot of my peers had lots of money. I did not. A lot of my peers had support at home. I definitely did not. And these were important parts of my story. So it's taken me many years to realize that who I am in so many ways was impacted by household functioning. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And what I've come to find out is that it's actually very apparent in a lot of students' lives, and not just low-income students' lives, but most students. In some way, shape, or form, household functioning plays a role in who we are as engineering students. For low-income students, though, it tends to be more abrupt, more dire, and we start to see it in their stories a little bit more. But that gives us a chance to then step back and start asking other students about these experiences too. So why low-income students in engineering? Well, we know that the number of low-income students in engineering is pretty much unknown. There is no data about it. I actually submitted a grant about this recently, and they said, they returned it back and said this is no longer part of priorities. So there is no interest in knowing this at the time, at least by the current administration. But socioeconomic status is still the greatest predictor of 6-year retention over race, ethnicity, and sex. It pretty much knocks those effects out of the equation. It doesn't mean that they're more important, but it means that it's more predictive. And only recently, in 2016, was low income status actually part of NSF's priorities, but that has since been removed. But how we talk about this really matters, and Sarah Atwood figured this out. She looked at a set of different predictors and found that different predictors tell us different things about the socioeconomic experience. And so it's important that we start to look at all those to get a fuller picture of the socioeconomic experience. Now, one thing I always like to come to is, how do we measure low income status, and why is this important? So this man here is John Maynard Keynes. In 1936, he wrote a book that said that low-income people had the same types of income, worked similar jobs, and lived in the same geographic regions. His idea, though, was we could use this to make more money. It was not about social justice. And since then, these types of measures have become prominent in measuring socioeconomic experience. And yet we have kind of lost track of everything else that goes with it. We think so much about these measures, education, mother's education. We think a lot about income, right? But we don't ask the questions of what happened to you, what is going on behind the scenes that makes this important to know about. And so as a graduate student, I started thinking, well, maybe it's not about income. Maybe it's about the power dynamics that lead to and from income. And we need to understand that holistic experience more. As I searched through the literature, that was when I was starting to figure out that I had post-traumatic stress disorder. And I started seeing all the deficit language that was used about low-income students. How we talk about them is not pleasant in most of the engineering education literature, and I've sought to change that ever since. So household function, this thing that I want to talk to you about, refers to the availability of resources, and the ones that we talk about are physical, social, and emotional. So physical ones could be those actual physical items that we talk about besides money. Social could be our connections to other people, so practical support, information, and our emotional support is emotional support, care, and a lot of the ways that we've seen it is a stable household. So on the other end of that is what a dysfunctional household looks like. And this is important to recognize. It's a lack of all these things. Not having a caring household, not having connections to others, and not having the things you need to be successful in your engineering pursuit. So why this? Well, understanding household functioning really requires us to understand asking why and not just the status quo. We often ask, why are certain resources missing from households? And a lot of the time we go to, well, families can't afford them and parents can't be present in students' lives. And we've kind of come to accept that and we've left it there. But we often don't ask, well, why is that happening? Well, families are, victim to racist, sexist, and classist societies that perpetuate and normalize inequality. We think about the low-income jobs that parents are working, but we often don't think about their employers that are underpaying them or taking their time away from their families, or how tax structures leave people without the income that they need, right? These are components that lead to and from income inequality. And household functioning really gets at what happens as a result of these types of inequalities. And so this talk is about my discovery of household functioning as an important component of the low-income experience. And so I'm going to talk to you about kind of where this started from with my dissertation work, and then I'm going to lead you into my project. So I'm going to kind of speed through my dissertation work because that's a monster in itself. Betsy, you can attest to that. It's a bit of a monster, and I want to lead you to the work that we're doing now because I think it's so much more interesting and so much more important. So I started with this dissertation question that looked at more than income. As I said, I was really troubled by how we measured things. And every question that I asked about the low income experience came back to, I hate how we measure it. And so my advisor and my committee member, so Allison Godwin and Alice Polly, said, then why don't you do something about it? And so I did. I decided that I was going to throw it on its head. And in a talk, Erin Seck came to Purdue, and she started talking about this awesome data set, a national data set, and getting restricted access to it. And I thought, there's my data right there. And so I went down this rabbit hole in Alice Polly's class and designed this study that eventually became my dissertation. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. But first I need to tell you about intersectionality theory because this is the center of my work, center of all of my work. So intersectionality is this idea that systems of oppression impact individuals in different ways, at different hierarchical levels. People are either privileged or they are oppressed in different ways. So there's privilege and there's domination. In my study, I brought in a feminist lens, and so my work kind of centers on feminist lenses, with this idea that different people have different experiences that together tell us about a greater whole of inequality. And so I centered that there were lots of different standpoints. I was going to collect a bunch of them. And I was also going to look at quantitative data and qualitative data that were each going to bring different perspectives together and tell us a little bit more that was generalizable and nuanced. And so I said, well, we need to understand the different facets of inequality. We need to think about the neighborhoods that people live, the education systems that they are a part of, the labor market, and other forms of inequality. And I brought this all together and it became this study. So instead, I thought I wanted to create a new measure of inequality. And I had this big idea of, here's all the variables that I could find in literature. I'm going to throw them all together and I'm going to make a model. It really slapped me in the face. There's lots of different things here. You can see segregation, you can see child poverty, levels of crime, free and reduced lunch, right? A lot of these are traditional predictors that maybe we've seen pop up in the literature here or there. A lot more of them in the K-12 space. And so I said, I'm going to bring all these together and I'm going to figure out what works for engineering. And so I hypothesized that if we brought all these effects together, we could understand inequality better. So that idea of my theoretical framing. And I wanted to ensure that we thought about racist, sexist, and classist impacts. So a lot of these variables I adjusted to those types of things. So we have neighborhood demographic representation. We have average occupational earnings that are based on different genders and races, right? And I didn't want to just do controls. I wanted to do it at an intersectional level. So I started digging deep into the feminist literature on quantitative work and try to figure out how to do this in a fem-quant and quant-crit way. So I had access to this really cool data set called the Educational Longitudinal Study of 2002. The set is public, but if you want access to things like addresses or specific intersectional data, you had to get restricted access. So I had to go and do this. And so it has a sample size of about 16,200. And the sample size there with the number of variables that is there allowed me to use all this data to do intersectional work, to look at all these intersectionally. So this was also combined with lots of other data. I kept finding data and I was like, what if I could like connect this together? So like, I'll show it later, but I have like a Charlie Day like picture with him like spiderwebbing on the wall. And so I thought, what if I could connect all these things? There are lots of different measures that have things like ID numbers or occupational codes or zip codes or things like that. And I thought, well, what if I connect all these? So I was able to connect 30 other sources of data that were publicly available or privately available. I got some access for some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so some of these sources are right here. So I found information from the National Center of Education Statistics, NSF, Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census, Center for American Progress, Pew Research Center, and MIT Living Wage Lab. And I took all these data points and I tried to connect them at the most finite level possible. So in some cases, I could go down to the tract level, and a tract, to give you a sense of that, I looked at Michigan. Michigan is made up of about 10 tracts. The University of Michigan is made up of about 10 tracts. A tract is usually about 10,000 people in size. And so I was able to connect all this data at a very finite level and make this model, which is typically not done in a lot of the literature that we're doing. So some of the data that was available to me was about different types of resources. And so I used factor analysis and figured out that there were 3 categories of resources. And I named them parent educational involvement, household educational resources, and school hindrances. So what kind of resources do you have that are physical that are available to you? What kinds of educational resources, educational support from parents do you have? And then what kinds of things are hindering your ability to engage in an educational pursuit? And if you're interested, I use best practices for confirmatory and structural fit to develop this model. I'll let you take a picture of that, and then I'll move on because we're not that interested in that, but it's there in case you're interested in that. And I came up with this model. So the model, I had all those things entering into a measure at the end. What I found was that model broke down almost immediately. And what's cool about structural equation modeling is it suggests paths that you can add or you can remove. And so I started going down that, following theory, and I came up with a model that was more structurally fit, which in hindsight makes a lot more sense. Why didn't I start with a structural model to begin with? So what this model tells you in essence is that the places that you live, the rurality of the area, is likely to predict the income that you have in your neighborhood. The neighborhood income you have is likely to predict the household income. So people live in similar places and have similar incomes. But those things are also impacted by education. And we also have to look up here. So it's not just about occupational income, but it's also about the weighted component of it. How does gender and race play a role in what wages you have available to you? So one of the components that I had was wage gaps. So I applied wage gaps at an intersectional level to that occupational data, and it actually kicked out the normal occupational income variable and left these ones. These ones were much more important. And so the income that you have available to you based on intersectionality was predictive of all these much more than normal occupational income. Then the last variables at the top was percent of Black women in your profession. We found that that probably had to do with the service industry. So if you were in a service industry, we know that there is more likely to be Black women and a higher percentage of Black women, and we know that that is then going to be predictive of your income. So this model is pretty interesting, but what it led to, I think, is much more interesting. It leads to predictions of these different resources. And there's a couple things in here. I don't have the total effect tables. I didn't want to throw tables at you, but I'll tell you the story of the data that's here. So we have these different resources, and I want to focus especially on household educational resources and parent educational involvement. These were the most predictive outcomes of this model, and more so for mothers. So if you follow the trend of data, the mother's education that we often use as a proxy for SES is not necessarily a predictive factor. The education doesn't matter itself. What it means is what access to resources is there as a result. And mother's education ended up being really important for that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that actually. But there's a couple things here. Inequality is structural, and resource inaccess is a result of that inequality. And lastly, intersectionality is really important. Okay, so there's those important ones there. So the model also demonstrates how it impacts engineering outcomes. So the model was predictive of these different application to, enrollment in, and persistence in engineering outcomes. And the resources were the most important components. And when it came to mother's education, it was also super, super predictive. And I'll tell you a little bit why about that when we get to the third study. But this was predictive, this does work, and we're planning on actually testing it with some other variables now. So we looked at the differences between college and engineering students. And for engineering students, household educational resources, parent educational involvement, and mother's occupation and the demographic representation of it were more important for engineering students than not. The story that the data told was that traditional measures of socioeconomic inequality were more predictive of college enrollment, access to, and persistence. But for engineers, it was more about resources. More about resources. And so what you had access to was predictive. And then total household neighborhood income. And so what this kind of tells is the story of access to parents who are more involved in one's education and access to resources necessary for educational pursuit have a significantly greater impact on engineering student success than non-engineering students. And you'll see why in the next part. So for my third study, I interviewed 6 students who, based on this model, were theoretically not likely to succeed, but they were all in their 4th year and graduating, except one. So there's the 6 participants. You can see that they had different levels of educational resources, involvement, different income, and then we also had different aspects of their location and their gender and sexual orientation and race. And this is how they wanted to be identified. In this, I focused on Samantha. Samantha has the lowest level of parent involvement, which was, of all the resources, the most predictive. And so I focused on that the most. Samantha is a queer Asian American female from a low-income family, particularly a rural environment. And her story really showed me a different nature of reality of why things were happening the way they were in this model. So to give you a sense, I used a critical realist framework to look at this. So critical realism says different natures of reality come together and show you a better understanding of what's happening. And so study 2 was that quantitative component, and Samantha's story was that qualitative component. And she made the Bitmoji. There was actually a series of Bitmojis that she made to help illustrate all these things. And so I was just a listener and a caretaker of her story. And so I listened to her story through interviews. It was about a 4-hour interview in this case. And I restoried it into a full story that's available in my dissertation for you to look at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the themes we found and why they're important. So what I found is that the story behind our model was not as straightforward as we thought. Resource access was socioeconomically organized, and that kind of makes sense, but power was at the center of everything that's happening. So Samantha had less access to resources at her school because of her rural environment. Her family was not very supportive at all, and in some ways it was dangerous. But she had this chosen family that really protected her. But power was at the center of all this. What was happening was typically due to power. It wasn't just chance that she had no resources. It was because of what was happening around her that she had no resources. And so she was asking this question of what could I access? Resource access, I found, was really directly related to belonging. Samantha always felt that the resources she had were telling her where she belonged and where she didn't belong. She'd say, well, the students have these things, but I don't. So like, I'm not supposed to be here. And she even said that she was lucky to be there. And this was a term that's been used by participants in all throughout my studies is, I'm lucky to be here. I'm a statistic that I'm not supposed to be here. She had lack of access to stimulating STEM activities and support. She had neighborhoods that were bare of resources, and she compared herself to students constantly. In her story, traditional and chosen family played an important role in supporting that belonging. As I said, she did not have support at home. And it was a very dangerous environment. The gist of the story is that her stepdad stole her identity and was pretty much making it impossible for her to live at her home by the end. And that impacted her long term. But she created this network of chosen family, people who supported her outside of her family in ways that allowed her to access the resources that she didn't otherwise have. And this involves teachers, staff, and other students, and sometimes the students, their families themselves, that she then said were my family. She used to call, or she called her coworkers, her aunts and her uncles, and said that she could call them anytime, and she still keeps in contact with them even today. And what she found, or what we found in the study, is that these individuals replaced the belonging that she had. She didn't feel like she got belonging at home, so she got it at school from these other people. And she also got resources that supported her as well. They supported her financially, they supported her with advice, and especially important, they supported her emotionally. And yeah, so she got these resources that she wouldn't have had. But trauma was a really big part of all these stories. And that's why I bring it up here. It's been a continuous theme in my work. There were over 30 types of traumas in these students' work. And I'm not talking about stressors. So stressors are things that stress you out. Traumas are things that lead to a physical reaction. And these students would talk about all sorts of things. For Samantha, sexual assault in high school impacted how she thought about participating with men in engineering. She said, how can I participate with men when they don't want me here and they want to use my body? Right? In some of our earlier work now, we had students whose fathers would tell them, you're just someone who wants to spread your legs and that's all you're good for, right? That's the types of things that engineering students are experiencing, and they're important parts of their stories. And for low-income students, these are even more prevalent. For Samantha, these betrayed adult connections really made her question who she could trust. In all these places, it always led to someone. Could I trust them? Could I be here without their help? And usually she said she couldn't trust them unless they were part of her chosen family. And so my working theory in some of my work is engineering elicits emotions of students with trauma and often re-traumatizes them. And we need to start exploring what some of that is. So that brings me to my present work. So there's a lot there, right? So my present work, bear with me, I'm gonna Charlie Davis. This is the first time I've actually kind of put this into a diagram of what I think is happening. And I hope it's clear, and we can always come back to it and ask questions about it. So we know that success is important for engineering students, and we know that their identity and belonging is central to the support. Belonging is the greatest predictor of student outcomes. We also know that agency is highly predictive of identity through Godwin's work, and that students who feel that they're more agentic are more likely to succeed because they feel like they can do the things that they want to do and change the world in the ways that they want to change it. But emotional resources are tied to this, and trauma experiences really disrupt this. Students who have greater emotional resources are more likely to feel like they belong. And students who have experienced trauma are less likely to feel they're agentic and that they have the resources that they need. For a traditional family, they are in charge of providing a lot of these emotional resources and physical resources, but often are absent in doing so. And for these family members, it's not just inequality, a lot of them are experiencing generational trauma themselves. But chosen family come into this and do a little bit of replacement. They provide a lot of physical and emotional resources. They provide support for agency. And in the end, some of them we found are experiencing trauma themselves, but they're healing from it, while traditional family are not. This is what I'll kind of talk about and outline over the next bit, but I wanted to kind of bring that into perspective. Trauma and emotional resources are at the center of all this, and they are impacted by other types of resources. And if we can understand emotional resources, we might be able to understand how to help low-income students be successful. So the work that I'm doing is centering on belonging, and the framework I'm using is Kelly Ann Allen's theory. And she says that belonging is made up of students' motivations, opportunities to belong, competencies for belonging, and perceptions of belonging. In a sense, that means if you feel like you can belong and people are giving you opportunities to belong and you want to belong, then you should belong. But if you don't have those things, then you might not. And what we're arguing is that physical resources impact emotional resources, and that joint impact is impacting especially students' perceptions to belong. If they don't feel like they have what they need to belong, and perceptions impact the other components, then how are they going to belong? So how do we start to disrupt that and help students feel that they're emotionally capable and they're able to perceive that they're able to belong? And this should not go without noticing that she just published a new version of this theory like a couple of days ago, so I had to throw this slide in. She has been interviewing school teachers and has added to this theory and said that context matters, individual differences matter, and that agency is at the center of all this. So it's a really, really fitting theory for the work that we're using. And I'm happy to, I see Robin, I see you like throw that. If you want that paper later, let me know. So I'm using this theory because it really tells us a lot about this story. Students need agency to belong. They need to feel like they can belong. And if they don't have the resources they need to belong, they're not going to feel like they belong. So when I started at Rowan, we started developing these items, a bunch of items that I'm going to tell you about. And I have to thank these three students for really making this happen. These three women of color came into my clinic experience and said, we want to learn about resources. We're all from low-income backgrounds, and we want to help disrupt engineering. And it was kind of the coolest experience I had the first semester. And so they read all of my narratives. They did thematically analyze them, and we're working on publishing this now. But they started developing a series of items based on students' experiences that we then tested. And I'll show you some of these. You look at some of these, here's the physical ones. So access to certain things. Some of these come from the ELS items, and others we've developed. Right? So they found, I know, owned name brand clothes was a big one that kept popping up. Then we had conditions of the house. So could you pay your bills? Was your house cluttered? Did you have clothing? Did you have access to transportation? Did your family go out very much? And then we had things about physical conditions. So we had a lot of people who had hoarders in their house. Houses were cluttered, in disrepair, without running water, or they weren't close to a grocery store. So students built all these items and we tested them. Along with this, they also developed a series of emotional items. If you've read this book, has anyone read this book? Just Betsy. So this book, if you're willing to go down a deep, dark rabbit hole, I highly recommend because it might change your life. Gibson talks about parents who aren't available to kids because they are not mature enough, is the word she uses. But I think it has to do a lot with inequality as well. So why are parents not mature in their relationships with their children? But she focuses especially on these different emotional components that we then turned into questions in our survey. So whether there's yelling in your house, physical altercations, tenseness, a feeling of walking on eggshells, do you talk to people comfortably? Do you have your concerns taken care of? Is your mental health taken seriously? Were you a confidant for your parents rather than them being a confidant for you? So was there parentification happening? Did they say things without thinking of your feelings? Did you receive attention? Did the mood of specific family members impact your household? And did you think that you couldn't make people in your household happy? Looking around, and not pointing anyone out, looking around, I see people starting to reflect on maybe their own experiences. And this is exactly what I mean. These are things that are relevant to most engineering students, and we have interviewed students that I'll talk about that have said that they are higher income and these things happen in their house, but these are much more dire for low income students and they're part of their stories. And so we use these items and started surveying. In the same period of time, we also started learning about adverse household or reverse childhood experiences and learned that this is an absent conversation in post-secondary STEM completely. We just finished a literature review about it. Over 60% of the United States has experienced an adverse childhood experience that is recognized by the CDC. 16% has experienced 4+. 53% of students who are post-secondary report at least one, while 14% report 4. And marginalized students are much more likely to experience ACEs. But ACEs correlates with higher depressive symptoms and psychological stress and lower feelings of self-worth, and that's connected to belonging. And we also have evidence that it leads to lower GPA and retention. So what role does this play in STEM is our big question. And our literature review found that there was absolutely no literature, absolutely none, about undergraduate STEM. And so we have a grant in review right now that we're hoping will be funded here soon. So we did a bunch of this survey stuff, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, but I want to jump to this. We interviewed a bunch of students across engineering about their emotional resources. And we found that chosen family were more likely to give students what they need emotionally. We identified chosen family as such from these interviews and some of our quantitative work. A chosen family member is a person outside of the traditional family with individual organizational power who genuinely and empathetically supports and uplifts students, disrupting the person's place amongst the structure-agency dialectic and in turn instilling a strong sense of belonging. In a more palatable form of words, these individuals have a greater sense of social justice, and they are trying to break down barriers for students. We've done some work on allies versus accomplices. So allies sit with students while accomplices break down barriers, and they do more than help them along. They actually help them break down those barriers and get to what they need. And so you see that piece of agency coming in, right? Students are trying to be agentic, but there's barriers in the way, and these individuals really help them do that. We learned why they choose chosen family over traditional family, though. Traditional family come with cultural and societal obligations. There's a lot of family obligation. So paying for your students' education or knowing everything about them. These students felt like they're almost unable to be agentic because their parents are watching over them and controlling them in a sense. But we found that siblings kind of overcome this barrier and they kind of act as like a straddler between chosen and traditional family. And all these individuals come without judgment, or chosen family. So they're really important for students because they actually provide them this emotional access that we're finding is important. And the gendering emotion makes it harder to seek help at home. Oh, I'm sorry, and there's greater authenticity and care to these relationships. So this led us to create these items and to test them. And coming back to this model, maybe you're starting to see how some of this comes together. And you'll start to see a little bit more. Emotional resources ended up being at the center. We found that physical and emotional resources impact engineering belonging, and this is unpublished at the moment. We're hoping to publish it soon. This is a structural equation model, and we found out that it impacts engineering identity and belonging directly. Emotional resources, which at the time we were calling household comfort, or a component of those items, impacts engineering identity directly and belonging directly. And household finances leads those environments to be more or less comfortable. And same with your access to educational resources. At school, students are relying on their teachers to make them feel like they're competent and recognized. And at home, they're also looking for that recognition and that comfort. That ability to be who they want to be as engineers and non-engineers comes from both places, but especially at home. So we took these resources and I decided to throw them into a machine learning model called Gaussian mixture modeling. And we found that there were 5 clusters of students. If you look here, you can see the different clusters, and you can also see how education is dispersed amongst them. The number 4 there is going to be your students with bachelor's degrees, or parents with bachelor's degrees. And you can see that more of them are in those clusters that are bigger, or sorry, not bigger, but more densely populated. So pay attention to clusters 2 and 5 in the next slide. The other students are more spread out, have less access to resources, and education is much more low in these cases. So we found that belonging was significantly different between clusters, and that resources were more organized in different ways. So for clusters 2 and 5, that's going to be your yellow cluster and your light blue cluster. Resources are more apparent, and belonging is much higher for these individuals. Okay. If you look at the resources, though, physical resources are spread out all over the place. Physical conditions are kind of spread out. But look at those emotional maturity. It's all over the board, and same with educational resources. Educational resources is that support for education. So like, are you helping me check my homework? Are you helping me study? Are we talking about college? Those things. All emotional components as well. And there's some groups that have it in much greater degrees than other students. So this leads us to the study I really want to talk about. So we recently received an EER to look at low-income students and their traditional and chosen families, to really dive into what was happening here and why is it happening. So we're looking at the strains that these family members experience and how it impacts student belonging. We're not just looking at the student story, we're looking at the family story too. So our big question is, if inequality leads to differences in belonging and family members are really at the center of this, what strains are they experiencing and why is this impacting everything the way that it's happening? So in part 1, we're interviewing STEM students, or STEM students. So the STEM program is scholarships for low-income STEM students. About 100 programs across the country in engineering have these programs. And then we interviewed members of their traditional and chosen families that they identified. So I said we interviewed 15 of these students, and we're using narrative inquiry, narrative interviews with first-person storytelling with limited smoothing to make sure that these stories are their own. We want it to be messy. We want it to be, as dire feeling as it is, because these are very emotional. These interviews ended up being about 2 hours apiece, and not a single student didn't cry. And so we had to lean on IRB and CAPS for these students. And so these were students all over the country, not just at Rowan. And then we use an analysis of narratives, and we are actually in the process of finishing that right now. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. Our preliminary findings is that tumultuous households and traumas impact students' abilities to trust others and make connections that result in negative aspects to belonging. In short, if you don't feel like you can make connections to other people because all of your past relationships have been betrayed, how are you going to belong in engineering? We find that students feel like they can't talk to other students, they can't talk to their professors, they can't talk to family members especially, because a lot of the environments they're coming from are abusive. They are, they're unstable in so many different ways. I'm going to tell you about some of those. And generational trauma and financial strains are also a part of this. Financial strains make these more tumultuous, and generational traumas often aid in having an unstable household. And of course, sexism, racism, and classism are huge parts of this that complicate those effects. So as I said, financial instability really caused a conflict in some of these students' households. So Aaron had a house that he had to intervene on. So he says, my parents fight all the time. I remember one time I was young and my mom went through her phone at my dad and his ear started bleeding. And my picture fell off the wall. That's what I remember. They would argue a lot. It's arguing all the time. All they argue about is money. My dad really cares about money since he grew up even worse off than we were and are now. He was pretty much homeless when he was younger. And it's the medical stuff too that weighs on everybody. My brother had stage 4 cancer, and he also had 4 other family members who had cancer at the same time. And he was going to die. And his hospital bill was upwards of $2 million or something once he started recovering. So financial strain is at the center of this. There's different traumas, and a lot of them lead to what we're seeing. And then the families also have traumas that they don't talk about. And so having to support or having to be the parent then in the household left Aaron without the emotional support he needed to thrive. He said, I tried to be there for my parents rather than them being there for me, if that makes sense. That's just how it was growing up. My brother and my dad both had cancer, so I didn't want to be a burden on them because they'd already done so much, had so much going on. So I didn't really act out, didn't really seem like I had anything going on. Rather, I was doing well with everything I was doing. So there was no reason to look for any problems. Or there was no way to see any problems because I was doing well with everything that I had going on. Or at least that's what it seemed like. I guess it's my parents. So I was just like, okay, he's good. And so then, I don't know, it's just that I would always be there. And as I said, I'd be there for my mom, but she was never there for me. The same for my dad. And I also just think they really didn't know how to be there for me. So he was left without this emotional support. And he says that because of that, he doesn't know how to trust other people in engineering because he can't. He's never known what it means to trust other people because his household has never taught him that. For Mia, Mia ran away from a dangerous situation. She left her home when she was 14. As she says, there was a lot of different things happening to her. Sexual, mental, and emotional abuse, and just being completely neglected from my own parents. I didn't talk to them at all. Nobody knew these things were happening. These were family members who were causing these transgressions to me. The reason why I never told anyone while I was in my childhood is because I was afraid I didn't have anywhere to stay, considering how often I was moving from different family member to family member. I didn't want to end up in foster care, so I just kept my mouth shut. I left home at 15. I pretty much did everything on my own. I was just not the type to ask for help from the people that I know, and I wasn't really it wasn't out of shame, it was more I don't want to owe anybody anything. So this component of trust continues to come through. Mia's story was especially hard for us because Mia had one friend, no connection to family. She had dropped out of school 7 times and was back and finally on scholarship to finish. And she has graduated, we found out, and is trying to move on with her life. But her friend Summer was her chosen family and really her only source of support. One of my best friends, Summer, is amazing. She comes from a great family. She talks to her parents every day. We lived together for about a year or two. We've been friends for almost 9 years now. Just being around her and seeing how she interacts with her own family makes me feel really good inside and inspires me to be more in touch with my emotions. Being able to talk about things like that and learning now how to have an interpersonal relationship with other people. Crazy thing is, we were both from the same area and never crossed paths or known each other until we moved to the same year in the city. I have friends who support me if I wanted them to, but I'm just very guarded. Summer understands me, not just because she's been through the same things that I have been through, but because she's had a very traumatic thing that happened in her life too. It's not really trauma bonding, but more an understanding of our personalities and also a matchup. She's the yin to my yang because she has the upbringing I wish I had, and she inspires me through my upbringing. We're all different. We're opposites of each other. I think emotionally, and I don't know, she just gets me. I just get her. The friendship is really effortless, and I don't have to worry about how she perceives me. So the sense of belonging is there with some people and not. She can trust Summer, but it's taken a long time for her to do so. Timothy is the third student I'll talk about, and he started working full-time at the age of 10. I needed to get a job to support my family. I was asking everyone, and everyone kept saying no because how young I was, until one place said yeah, and I would just clean the tables, like sweep the floors, and this was all under the table. But then someone called in sick one day and they asked, would you be okay with helping us out in positions like dishwashing? He was like, I'm sure, why not? So I started washing dishes, and then I eventually said something like, you're pretty good at this. So I eventually learned every position, and by age 14, I became one of the managers of the Passet restaurant. And by age 18, I became a partial owner. The owners really took care of me. And while he was doing this, he was telling us that he was about to graduate and he was still the co-owner of this restaurant. But Timothy's boss supported him and really made sure that he was successful in his future engineering endeavors. Emotionally, if I had anything wrong with myself, I would just go talk to my boss, and he would just give me his wisdom and make sure that I had this resources to support and tell me I needed to further educate myself. He'd give me a book to read. And if I'm honest, he'd just be like, you want to gain someone's trust? Here's a book about gaining someone's trust, all right? I didn't have many friends in high school. He was like, here's a book on how to make friends in high school. It's little stuff like that. Probably another reason why I'm good at college, because I've read a lot over my years. When I went home, if my mom, sister, or brother didn't cook, they made sure, or I think it's supposed to be I made sure they had food. If we were locked into the house, they made sure I had a place to sleep. So the work was a quarter of a mile, half a mile at max. So I'd walk to work every day, walk to the house if they needed to, and stuff like that. Sorry, I'm fixing myself here. He's talking about the owners and his boss. So we see this like replacement of resources. Some of it's physical, but most of it's emotional. Showing students, you can do the thing you want to do. You can be agentic. Let me help you. So we're actually in the process, we finished all the student interviews and we're actually in the process of interviewing 75 traditional and chosen family members. We've asked each of these students to tell us a list of the people and to provide us the contact information to the people that support them the most, people that are so integral to where they are today. We have K-12 teachers, coaches, advisors, parents, siblings, neighbors, and we're going to all of them slowly but surely. We've been working on the university level faculty right now to kind of train ourselves with these folks, and we're going to do family last because we think that they're going to be a little bit harder. We're using narrative inquiry again, and we're letting them tell their story. But the story we're asking them to tell is, tell us how you supported this student. We got approval to say, this person said you were a very supportive person, and we want to know why. And then we start digging down into their own upbringing and their childhoods too. And even without prompting them, they're coming up in the stories, and they're telling us these stories. What we're finding is traditional family feel the strain of inequities and traumas that they're trying to heal from. The same thing we were seeing in the student stories. Some of these inequities, we're seeing low wage work, racism, sexism, classism, and generational or present trauma is a huge part of it. Something happened to the parent or is happening now that impacts how they care for themselves and the environment now. Mostly it's unfortunately been dads, which is where I think some of this gendered labor is coming from. Dads don't want to talk about what happened to them, and they're unwilling to, and oftentimes their families have no idea what happened to them because they never share it. But it shows up in their emotions, and it shows up in how they deal with situations. Healing has not happened for most of them, and it impacts the way that they go about parenting, which is influencing the emotional resources that students have access to. And as you can see, this is not just engineering students who are low income. This can apply to any student, just it's much more dire here because financial strains make it worse. For our chosen family, privilege limits the strain that they're experiencing because they typically have more money, they're working in the educational system, in the school, or sorry, university level at least so far. They usually have a firm knowledge of institutional structure and can help the students along. And the strains they experience impact how much emotional support they can provide and when. The strains that we're seeing are things like, I have limited money at my institution, I only have so much time in a day to support students, things like that, but they're still trying to do so. Chosen family also have experienced something that is like the low income student and seems to invest in their success for that reason. Some of our participants were low income students themselves, a lot of them actually so far, and a lot of them have experienced childhood or other adult trauma. And what we're finding is most of them are supportive, especially because they've gone through a process of healing. They're thinking about their emotions. A lot of them are going to therapy, whereas a lot of our family members who are traditional either don't have the access to or are just not going to these types of things to do this healing. And most importantly, we're finding that students and family alike are saying that they feel like they share a language with each other. We can talk about the same things, we're on the same level, and we know when we say things that are traumatic or things about low income experience that it's automatically understood by both parties. So that we are still creating narratives out of those ones, so I couldn't really show you any of the data. But our plan next, after we create all these, is to take those family and chosen family narratives and build them into the student story to create what we're calling an ecosystem narrative. So what is the student experiencing and how do the other people come into play? So if they talk about a parent, let's insert the parent's story into that area of the narrative. If they talk about a teacher that supports them, let's insert the story there and start to get an understanding of what's happening to everybody and how does that end up resulting in belonging impacts for the student in the end. If we think back to Samantha's narrative, we can start to get back at that power. What is the power that's happening? What are the resources that are available that are unavailable? And who's a part of the story in making the student feel that they're successful or not successful? So I'm happy to talk about any of this more. I want to thank my research group, and I also want to thank the National Science Foundation and the New Jersey Office of the Secretary of Higher Education for funding all this work. We are just getting started. As I said, we have a grant in review right now looking at childhood trauma. And then this project I think has a long way to go. And then my career work is looking at household functioning, is the plan. So keep your fingers crossed that gets funded because that'd be an incredible set of stories. We'd be interviewing like another 100 family members and trying to get a sense of, what happened to you and what happened to your family and why is that important to understand what's going on across the nation in engineering. So thank you very much. I'm open to questions about any of this. I'm also open to personal questions.
Justin,
Yeah.
when you do the interviews, are they in person?
If the student or the person is nearby, otherwise they are virtual.
Do you find that there's a difference in the quality of that interaction?
I'll say yes, but not for the reason you'd think. So some of these students are Rowan students, and I am their professor and their mentor for the STEM program. And so one of the family members that was mentioned by all of our own students was me. So my students got to interview me as one of the chosen family members. Um, and so, and I was training my grad students, so I was kind of in the room as they're saying nice things about me. Um, so it's a little bit different because they know me a little bit differently. Um, and I think there's a level of trust that we've gained over working with them for a year. So some backstory, I teach in an entire low income cohort in first year engineering. So this year I have 18 low income students in a class of 20. Um, and so I get a real opportunity to engage with them and tell them my story and also um, turn the curriculum into something that is going to be meaningful for them as low income students. So yes, but not for the reason you'd expect. We are going to be moving to so a lot of the students that I've mentioned. We're going to be doing in-person interviews with a lot of their elementary and middle school teachers. So we're planning on going and hopefully being able to talk to them in person.
The other question I have is, I love that you're doing all this. Very supportive of the idea and the underlying foundation of everything. What is your goal? If once we establish that there's this need for belonging and that there's some deficit existing, what is the actual goal that you want to have students become more belonged so that they are more successful? And then what is success and what that looks like?
Yeah, so there's two things that I envision. The first thing is being able to support students who are having these emotional or lacking these emotional resources, either in the classroom or personally. I eventually would like to build a center that is about supporting low-income students in engineering that is ran by low-income students for low-income students. So there's that opportunity to share language, share stories, share needs and resources. On the other end of this, what I've put into my career work or my career award is I would like to be able to start training instructors or across the country to be prepared for this as well. How do we start supporting students emotionally in different ways? And I'm happy to share what my hypothesis is about how you do that. But yeah, how can we start to share these things with students so that we can create those emotional bonds earlier?
I'm with you.
Yeah. So I'll share that really quick. So what we're finding in a lot of the work that we're doing, we have some mental health work as well, is that having conversations about mental health and emotions is a critical component in starting to build those emotional resources. You immediately connect over things at a deeper level. And when students feel like they can connect with professors, then those emotional resources become much more present and available. Professors become trusted allies. They become, whether or not they're really helping them. Like we've interviewed a couple faculty members of like, I don't even know this student. Like they were in my class and we're like, yeah, they said that you were like most integral to their support. They're like, I don't even know this person. We even showed them a picture. Like, I don't remember this student. Like I had 100 people in that class. Like, but like students are connecting in different ways because these faculty are talking about emotions in the classroom. They're doing mental health work and students are really connecting with that. So if you want to take something back, start talking about emotions. And I have I'll share a tip here at the end too. Yeah, Betsy.
I know you mentioned at the beginning of this that like the deficit narrative that you were seeing in literature really bothered you. So I guess now at your current stage, how are you trying to like balance those narratives or how do you approach it?
Yeah, so the argument I made in a paper called about a student named Nando, it was an FIE paper, was that if the asset conversation is not enough and the deficit conversation is not enough, we have to talk about the middle ground. So what are the deficits, what are the assets, and why is each happening? Why is this an asset? Well, it's an asset because we don't talk about it, we don't value it. Why is this a deficit? Well, because inequality is at play and making that deficit known and apparent. So I think that's the balance, is we need to talk about both and we always need to have the structural conversation about why is this happening. There's a great book, and I suggested it to Betsy this morning, by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey called What Happened to You. It is a book about childhood trauma, but they start to turn the narrative of, not all of these things that are going on in students' lives, but what happened to you, what's your story, and why is that story happening, and how do we start pushing back on it? Great book, wonderful audiobook. It's a lot though. Yeah.
Actually, from Tony Morales in the chat, and if you want to unmute Tony, or I can read out your question. I'll read it.
Sure. Oh, you could read it. That's fine.
We're crazy.
Or I could, I don't know, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So my question is basically, what have you seen in these different colleges to address these issues of student belonging? And also, what, from your research, what would you most recommend the college is doing? You just said that instructors should bring in some mental health talk and focus on emotions. Now, a lot of the faculty in STEM research, I think they're not so conversant with that, and it's difficult for them themselves. So I guess I just want to hear your thoughts on this, because I mean, this is an issue. Inevitably, we have low income students, and we have a lot of resources at the University of Michigan, but it's hard to get over the hump of convincing students to, number one, use the resources and not feel stigmatized by using the resources. I mean, that's an issue for us, I think.
Yeah. So to answer your question first about what we're seeing, there are several STEM programs across the country that are doing cohorting, and that has been really impactful. And most of them are doing cohorting, but the ones that are most important or the best ones, I think, are the ones that they're bringing students together on a regular basis with faculty members, and talking about emotional components that are happening to them. Like, what's happening to you? Tell us about your navigation process. And then these advisors that most of these students are naming as chosen family too, are engaging in this conversation rather than just kind of being a side player and letting it happen. So some programs are just like bringing students together and then they kind of like don't show up, like the advisors. The other ones are really engaged, and making sure that they're part of the process. And so I think that's what it's got to be. Like, a lot of what we do in belonging on campus, and in my new role at Rowan, we're finding that belonging is very siloed across campus. We often create things for students to do together, and the faculty kind of step back. And if faculty are part of it, they're there and just kind of present, but they're not actually engaging. And so what I think we need to start doing is really being engaged as faculty. And I think a hard part about that is we're not trained to do this stuff, especially we're not trained to deal with trauma. I'm not trained to deal with trauma, and I'm kind of like forcing myself to have to be now, with all this work. But we have to, we absolutely have to have these conversations about emotions, because students want to have these conversations. We have data to prove that. Students are like, let's talk about mental health. Like, we don't talk about this in engineering. Let's talk about mental health. Like, I need to talk about mental health. I need to talk about what's going on, because right now I'm splitting, students are talking about like splitting themselves. Like, I have my engineering self and then I have my side self. And we have a paper in process called Escaping from the Stress of Engineering, where students are talking about doing engineering adjacent activities, things that we would not count as engineering, but they call engineering, because they're trying to negotiate their identities so that they feel like they can stay and belong in engineering.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the answer is engage emotionally with your students. Share a resource that I have, and I have one of these actually for Karen, so remind me to give it to you. But I have this deck of cards called Stress Less. You can buy them on Amazon. They're about $10. And I started using them when a therapist recommended them to me, and I started bringing them into my class. And so we do an activity every day that is either mindfulness, gratitude, meaning and purpose, something like that. Some of them say they're like 10 minutes, but you can do them in like 3 to 4 minutes in your class, the start of class. We have some faculty that are starting to do it in our discipline, as well as mechanical engineering, and students are absolutely vibing with it. So if you want to get started, get a deck of these and just start doing activities at the beginning of class. It only takes 3 to 4 minutes, and your students engage with it and they want it. Some of them think that's fluffy, but the other 99% love it. And I think this starts the conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We're a little over time, so we'll thank Dr. Major again. Might be able to hang out for a few minutes if people want to stay. But
absolutely.
thank you all for being here. Thank you again for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.